The night was cold, the clouds heavy with November rain, and the faint hum of jet engines carried through the dark skies of the Pacific Northwest. In 1971, America was caught in a restless mood. The Vietnam War weighed heavily on the nation's conscience. Protests filled the streets. Television news carried images of turmoil. The country was searching for stability, yet it was also a time of shifting culture, rebellion, and distrust in authority. Against this backdrop, one man quietly boarded a plane in Portland, Oregon, and set in motion a mystery that would puzzle investigators for decades. He didn't stand out in the airport terminal that afternoon. Wearing a simple business suit, a black tie, and carrying only a briefcase, he looked like countless other travelers passing through on the busy holiday weekend. He purchased his ticket under the name Dan Cooper, paying in cash. It was a small act that would later prove important, for that name, slightly altered by a news mistake, would become etched into American legend. The man was calm, polite, and unassuming. The Northwest Orient Airlines flight he boarded, Flight 305, was just a short hop from Portland to Seattle. It was a routine commuter flight, lasting less than an hour. Most passengers were businesspeople heading home before Thanksgiving. None could have known that their journey would become the center of one of the most baffling unsolved cases in FBI history. As the aircraft taxied down the runway and lifted into the overcast skies, the man in seat 18C lit a cigarette, a common sight in those days. He ordered a bourbon and soda, sipping it with quiet composure. He was not nervous. He was not fidgeting. If anything, he appeared completely at ease, like a man who had done this many times before. Flight attendants recalled his manners as courteous and soft-spoken. He was the kind of passenger no one would look at twice. But everything changed when he passed a folded note to a young flight attendant. She slipped it into her pocket, assuming it was nothing more than another man making small talk or asking for a phone number. But he leaned closer and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." The words froze her. When she opened the note, the message was direct and chilling. The man claimed his briefcase contained explosives. He instructed her to sit beside him, to remain calm, and to follow his directions carefully. His tone was not wild or aggressive. Witnesses later said he seemed oddly controlled, almost professional, as if he were reading from a carefully rehearsed plan. Inside the briefcase, he allowed her a glimpse of what appeared to be wires, red sticks, and a battery, convincing enough to silence any doubt. The young attendant returned to the cockpit with his demands. The plane, she explained to the captain, was now under the control of the man in seat 18C. His request was simple but audacious. $200,000 in cash, for parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting in Seattle to refuel the aircraft for further travel. If his instructions were met, he promised no harm would come to the passengers or crew. For the flight crew, the decision was clear. They had no choice but to comply. The captain contacted air traffic control, who quickly relayed the hijackers' demands to authorities on the ground. The FBI, the airline, and local law enforcement scrambled to respond. The era of heightened airport security was still years away. At the time, hijackings were becoming disturbingly common, though most were politically motivated attempts to divert planes to Cuba. But this was different. This was not about ideology. This was about money, and it was about precision. The passengers remained unaware of the drama unfolding around them. The crew managed to keep them calm, explaining only that the flight would be slightly delayed upon arrival. Meanwhile, on the ground in Seattle, the authorities raced to gather the money and parachutes. The ransom money was provided by the airline, its serial numbers carefully photographed and recorded for future tracking. Back in the cabin, the hijacker continued to project an air of control. He asked for meals for the crew, insisted the lights be dimmed, and even offered to pay for his drink. It was as though he was performing a strange dance between menace and courtesy. Those who interacted with him described him not as frantic or unstable, but as someone who seemed entirely at ease with the situation, as if he had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The plane circled Seattle for nearly 2 hours as night fell, giving law enforcement time to gather his demands. Finally, when the signal came that everything was ready, the aircraft descended. The runway was lined with emergency vehicles, their lights flashing in the dark rain. Yet the atmosphere remained strangely calm. The man in the black tie had kept his word so far. No one was harmed, no voices raised. When the jet came to a stop, the exchange was carefully orchestrated. The money was brought aboard in a canvas bag. 4 parachutes were handed over, including 2 reserve chutes. A fuel truck pulled alongside the aircraft, refilling its tanks as ordered. All the while, the passengers still did not realize the true danger they had been in. The hijacker allowed them to disembark once the ransom was delivered. To the outside world, it appeared as though everything had gone smoothly. Only the crew remained. The hijacker instructed the pilots to prepare for takeoff once more. This time, however, their flight plan was unusual. He ordered them to head toward Mexico City, but with strict conditions. The aircraft was to fly low, at around 10,000 feet, with its landing gear down and flaps partially extended. He wanted the cabin unpressurized, the speed kept slow. These demands puzzled the pilots, but soon the reason would become clear. The storm continued to sweep across the northwest as the jet roared back into the sky. Rain lashed against the windows. Darkness pressed in from every side. In the cockpit, the crew could only guess at what their mysterious passenger was planning. In the cabin, he moved calmly, securing the money, checking the parachutes, and preparing himself for something that defied belief. At approximately 8 p.m., as the aircraft flew south over the rugged terrain of Washington state, the man opened the rear stairs of the Boeing 727. Against the roar of the engines and the howl of the storm, he fastened the money to himself, secured one of the parachutes, and stepped into the night. In an instant he was gone. When the crew felt the shift in pressure and the sudden rush of air, they knew he had made his move. The stairs rattled violently before being pulled back up. The plane continued on its course, but its most infamous passenger had vanished into the darkness below. The mystery had just begun. The crew of Flight 305 sat in stunned silence as the plane carried on through the storm. They knew he was gone, yet the magnitude of what had just happened took time to sink in. Somewhere below them, in the wilderness of Washington state, a man carrying $200,000 had leapt into the night, trusting his life to a parachute and the cover of darkness. The cockpit crew tried to remain focused, but the tension weighed heavily. They had been instructed not to look back into the cabin, not to interfere. Now, with the hijacker gone, all they could do was follow orders and land the plane safely in Reno, Nevada, where law enforcement was already waiting. When the aircraft finally touched down after midnight, FBI agents, police officers, and military personnel swarmed the plane. They moved quickly, searching every corner of the cabin, half expecting to find the hijacker still hiding somewhere on board. But the cabin was empty. Only his black tie and a mother-of-pearl tie clip were left behind on his seat, small tokens of a man who had vanished into myth. The passengers, who had been allowed to leave earlier in Seattle, had no idea that history had been unfolding around them. For them, it had been little more than an inconvenient delay. But for investigators, the events of that night presented an unprecedented challenge. Never before had someone hijacked a commercial airliner in such a calculated, mysterious way, and escaped without a trace. The FBI immediately launched one of the most intensive manhunts in its history. They called it NORJAC, short for Northwest Hijacking. Dozens of agents were deployed to scour the suspected drop zone, a vast stretch of forest and rugged terrain between Seattle and Reno. Helicopters hovered overhead, search teams trekked through dense woods, and boats combed the Columbia River, all searching for any sign of the mysterious man who had jumped from the plane. But the conditions were against them. The weather that night had been unforgiving: rain, strong winds, and near-freezing temperatures. The terrain below was treacherous: thick forests, jagged mountains, and rivers running swift with winter currents. Survival for an untrained man would have been nearly impossible. Yet, as the days passed, no body was found. No parachute, no money scattered across the forest floor. It was as though he had disappeared into thin air. Meanwhile, in FBI field offices across the country, agents pieced together every scrap of evidence from the hijacking. They interviewed the flight attendants, who provided detailed descriptions of the man. He was in his mid-40s, olive-skinned, about 6 feet tall, with dark hair and a calm, professional demeanor. He had spoken intelligently, without any discernible accent, and had seemed familiar with aviation terms and procedures. The airline ticket he purchased gave little to work with. He had paid in cash, using the name Dan Cooper. But a simple error by the press soon altered the record forever. When local newspapers reported the hijacking, one mistakenly printed the name as D.B. Cooper. The typo spread like wildfire and the name stuck. From that moment forward, the man who vanished into the storm would be known to the world as D.B. Cooper. The media seized upon the story instantly. Newspaper headlines blared the details of the daring escape. Television anchors recounted the strange politeness of the hijacker, his demand for parachutes, his leap into the unknown. To the public, it was both terrifying and strangely captivating. Hijackings had become disturbingly common in that era, but none had ended like this. D.B. Cooper had pulled off the impossible. He had taken the money, jumped from a moving plane, and vanished without leaving a trace. In a time when Americans were weary of war, politics, and social unrest, Cooper became something unexpected, an anti-hero. To some, he was a criminal mastermind who outsmarted the authorities. To others, he was reckless and dangerous. But to nearly everyone, he was fascinating. The FBI, however, had no time for myth or legend. They faced intense pressure to capture the man who had humiliated them. Agents scoured local airports, hotels, and motels, checking records for anyone matching his description. They tracked down known parachutists, pilots, and military veterans. Hundreds of suspects were questioned. Some seemed promising at first, but none could be definitively tied to the crime. Back in the forests of Washington, the search dragged on. Volunteers joined law enforcement in combing through the wilderness. Bloodhounds sniffed through brush and riverbanks. Still there was nothing. Weeks passed, then months, and still no sign of the hijacker or his loot. The case, once urgent, began to grow colder. And yet, the mystery only deepened. If D.B. Cooper had perished in the jump, where was his body? Where was the parachute, the bag of money? If he had somehow survived, how had he managed to escape so completely? No reports surfaced of someone suddenly spending large amounts of cash. None of the bills, marked and recorded by the FBI, had appeared in circulation. It was as though the earth had swallowed both the man and his fortune. Theories began to swirl. Some believed he had died instantly, his parachute torn apart by the fierce winds, his body lost in the wilderness forever. Others speculated he had landed safely and blended back into society, perhaps even living under a new identity just miles away from where investigators searched. Still others wondered if he had accomplices waiting to pick him up on the ground, spiriting him away before anyone could respond. What made the mystery even more intriguing was the preparation behind it. Whoever Cooper was, he seemed to know the Boeing 727 intimately. He knew it had rear stairs that could be lowered in flight, a feature unfamiliar to most passengers. He knew the altitude and speed required for a survivable jump. He even knew to request multiple parachutes, ensuring the FBI couldn't sabotage them without endangering innocent lives. This was no impulsive act. It was carefully calculated. But calculated by whom? The FBI worked tirelessly to narrow the list. They considered former military paratroopers, airline workers, engineers, and even ex-convicts with knowledge of aviation. Each suspect brought new possibilities but no answers. Every time investigators thought they were close, the trail went cold. Meanwhile, the public fascination grew. Songs were written about D.B. Cooper. Jokes and stories spread through bars and workplaces. For some, he became a symbol of rebellion, a man who had defied authority and simply disappeared. For others, He was a dangerous criminal whose recklessness could have cost dozens of lives. The line between fact and legend blurred more with each passing day. The real man who had boarded Flight 305 in Portland had been replaced by an icon. D.B. Cooper, the mysterious skyjacker who pulled off the greatest escape in modern history. And yet, behind the myth, investigators still wrestled with the simplest question. Did he live or did he die? The FBI could not afford to let the case go unsolved. Resources poured into Norjack. Sketches were distributed nationwide. Leads were tracked across the country. Cooper could have been anyone. A neighbor, a coworker, the man down the street. The mystery gnawed at agents and civilians alike. But despite all efforts, the winter passed with no breakthrough. By the time the first anniversary of the hijacking arrived, D.B. Cooper had already cemented himself as a legend. He had leapt not just from a plane, but into American folklore. The case was far from over. But with no evidence, no body, and no money in circulation, investigators faced a haunting possibility. The man they were chasing might already be gone forever. As the months turned into years, the legend of D.B. Cooper only grew stronger. The FBI kept the case open, but each lead seemed to fade into nothing. America, however, was captivated. Newspapers revisited the story regularly, spinning new theories, interviewing locals from the Pacific Northwest, and speculating about what might have happened to the man who had vanished from the sky. The country was entering a new era of skepticism and fascination with crime. Watergate was eroding trust in government. Hollywood was beginning to turn anti-heroes into cultural icons. Against this backdrop, D.B. Cooper became more than just a name. He became a myth, a symbol of rebellion against authority, a man who defied the system and got away with it. But for the FBI, the reality was far less glamorous. They were under immense pressure to solve the case. Hijackings had already been a significant problem during the late 1960s and early 1970s, and Cooper's escape threatened to inspire copycats. If he could vanish without a trace, what was stopping others from trying the same? Agents worked day and night chasing down every tip. One lead took them to a Portland man who had bragged about being Cooper after a night of drinking, but he was quickly cleared. Another suspect, a Vietnam veteran with parachute experience, seemed promising until his alibi checked out. Over and over, the cycle repeated. Excitement, investigation, disappointment. The mystery took on a strange life of its own. Psychics called the FBI claiming to know where Cooper had landed. Treasure hunters scoured the woods, convinced they could find the lost ransom. Amateur sleuths mailed in theories, some elaborate and convincing, others wildly impossible. It seemed that everyone wanted to solve the case. But the FBI's official investigation remained grounded in evidence, or rather, the lack of it. The parachutes were never found. The money never surfaced. And the man himself seemed to have disappeared from existence. It was during these years that the first sketches of D.B. Cooper began circulating widely. Based on eyewitness accounts from the flight attendants and crew, the drawings depicted a man with sharp features, a clean-cut appearance, and dark sunglasses. The sketches were plastered across newspapers, post offices, and television broadcasts. The image was iconic. The mysterious man in the suit, cigarette in hand. His eyes hidden behind black shades. Despite the exposure, no definitive matches emerged. Thousands of tips poured in, but none broke the case open. For FBI agents, it was deeply frustrating. They had solved countless other hijackings. But this one, this single man in a business suit, continued to slip through their fingers. The public, however, treated Cooper differently. Instead of fear, there was a strange admiration. Songs were written about him. Bars named cocktails in his honor, and comedians made jokes about the man who had beat the system. While law enforcement viewed him as a criminal who had endangered lives, some Americans saw him as a kind of folk hero. This division highlighted something deeper about the times. In an era marked by mistrust of authority, Cooper represented a figure who outwitted the government without leaving a trail of victims behind. He hadn't fired a gun. He hadn't hurt anyone. He had simply demanded money, taken it, and disappeared. That, in itself, made him an enigma, a criminal who did not fit the mold. But beneath the legend, serious questions lingered. Could a man really have survived such a jump? The Boeing 727 had been flying through stormy weather at night, over thick forests and freezing rivers. At 10,000 feet, with high winds and limited visibility, even an experienced paratrooper would have faced staggering odds. The FBI quietly leaned toward the belief that Cooper had perished that night. Still, the lack of physical evidence made certainty impossible. And without a body, the possibility of survival remained tantalizingly real. The years dragged on, and then came a moment that reignited public fascination. In 1978, a deer hunter in Washington stumbled across a torn placard deep in the woods. It bore instructions for lowering the rear stairs of a Boeing 727, the very model Cooper had hijacked. The FBI examined it closely, but the discovery only deepened the mystery. It suggested Cooper had indeed leapt somewhere in the area, yet still no trace of him appeared. Then, in 1980, came a breakthrough unlike any before. A young boy on vacation with his family along the Columbia River uncovered a bundle of rotting cash buried in the sand. The bills were bundled together with rubber bands, partially disintegrated, yet still recognizable. When turned over to authorities, they confirmed what many had long waited for. The serial numbers matched the ransom money given to Cooper. The discovery electrified the public. For the first time in nearly a decade, there was physical evidence connecting to D.B. Cooper. But the questions it raised were more perplexing than the answers it provided. How had the money ended up there, miles from the suspected drop zone? Why had only a fraction of it, just under $6,000, been found, while the rest remained missing? Some theorized that Cooper had lost the money during the jump, the bills carried downstream until they buried themselves in the riverbank. Others speculated that he had hidden it intentionally, only to be thwarted by nature. Yet another possibility lingered, that the money had been planted, either by Cooper himself or by someone else, to mislead investigators. The FBI scoured the area, digging, searching, examining the soil and water. They hoped the discovery would lead them to the rest of the fortune, or perhaps even Cooper's remains. But nothing else turned up. The riverbank yielded only that single bundle of decayed bills, and then once again the trail went cold. For the investigators, it was another bitter reminder of the case's resilience. For the public, it was fuel for the legend. The story of D.B. Cooper now carried yet another chapter, one that kept alive the possibility that he had indeed survived, living somewhere quietly while the world wondered. By the 1980s, D.B. Cooper was no longer just a criminal investigation. He was a cultural phenomenon. Movies, books, and documentaries speculated endlessly about his fate. Bars in the Pacific Northwest hosted annual Cooper parties, celebrating the mystery. His face, immortalized in FBI sketches, became a symbol of the unsolvable. But for the FBI, the fascination was a constant reminder of unfinished work. Agents retired and new ones took their place, each inheriting the same frustrating puzzle. Despite thousands of hours of investigation, interviews, and field searches, the case remained stubbornly unsolved. As the decade closed, Cooper was no closer to being identified than he had been on that stormy night in 1971. Yet the legend endured, refusing to fade. For the public, D.B. Cooper had become more than a man. He was a question mark etched into history, a reminder that sometimes, even in an age of modern investigation, one person could slip away into the night and leave behind only mystery. The 1980s had given the story new life. But the case was far from finished. In the decades to come, fresh suspects, new theories, and even scientific analysis would be brought to bear. The question remained the same, echoing across time. Who was D.B. Cooper, and what became of him after that daring leap into the darkness? By the early 1990s, 2 decades had passed since D.B. Cooper vanished from Flight 305, and the mystery had only deepened. The FBI's file on the case had grown massive, filled with interviews, tips, and theories, but there was still no definitive answer. The silence of the intervening years only added to the aura surrounding the case. For the public, Cooper had become a symbol of the unsolved, the unanswered, and the unknown. But within the Bureau, patience was wearing thin. New generations of agents were taking over the Norjack investigation, and with each transition came renewed determination to close the case. Yet every promising lead seemed to collapse under scrutiny. One of the strongest suspects to emerge during this era was a man named Richard McCoy. In 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy, a Vietnam veteran and helicopter pilot, hijacked a plane in nearly identical fashion. He demanded $500,000 and parachutes, then escaped mid-flight. Unlike Cooper, however, McCoy was caught, tried, and sentenced to prison, only to later escape and die in a shootout with police. For a time, some investigators were convinced McCoy and Cooper were one and the same. The similarities between the two cases were undeniable. But physical evidence, eyewitness accounts, and timelines didn't quite fit. McCoy was younger than Cooper was believed to be, and his motives seemed less calculated. Though intriguing, the McCoy theory ultimately failed to provide a definitive answer. Other suspects surfaced as well. Kenneth Christensen, a former flight attendant and paratrooper, was pointed to by some as a strong candidate. His brother claimed that Kenneth had once hinted at hidden money and had lived in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the hijacking. Yet again, no conclusive evidence tied him to the crime. Then there was Dwayne Weber, a man who, on his deathbed in 1995, allegedly confessed to his wife, "I'm Dan Cooper." After his death, she turned over belongings that seemed suspicious: an old Northwest Orient airline ticket, books about skyjacking, and vague statements he had made over the years. For a while, Weber's confession drew significant attention. But once more, FBI analysis concluded that there was not enough evidence to confirm him as the man behind the black tie and sunglasses. With every new suspect, the cycle repeated. Hope, investigation, and then disappointment. The case refused to yield its secrets. Meanwhile, the public's fascination only grew. Books were published claiming to have solved the case. Amateur sleuths gathered in online forums, trading theories and evidence. Documentaries revisited the story, each offering a new angle or suspect. The mystery had moved beyond the realm of law enforcement into the territory of folklore. But the FBI was not ready to let it go. Advances in forensic science offered new hope. In the early 2000s, investigators examined Cooper's tie, one of the few pieces of physical evidence left behind. They subjected it to modern analysis, searching for DNA traces, skin cells, or fibers that might provide a breakthrough. The results were frustrating. Partial DNA samples were recovered, but they were too limited to match conclusively to any suspect. The tie did, however, reveal trace elements, rare metals used in aerospace manufacturing. This suggested Cooper may have worked in a field connected to aviation or engineering. It was a clue but not a solution. As technology advanced, so too did theories. Could Cooper have been a disgruntled airline employee, using his insider knowledge to pull off the perfect crime? Or was he a military veteran, hardened by years of combat, who saw in the skies of the Pacific Northwest an opportunity for one final mission? The silence from Cooper himself was perhaps the most haunting element of all. In the years following the hijacking, the FBI monitored financial systems closely, waiting for the ransom money to appear. The serial numbers had been carefully recorded, and any bill that entered circulation could have pointed them to Cooper. Yet apart from the small bundle found on the riverbank in 1980, not a single bill ever surfaced. That silence suggested two possibilities. Either Cooper had died in the jump, never to spend a dime, or he had hidden the money so well that it remained untouched. Both scenarios carried equal weight, and neither could be confirmed. By the mid-2000s, the FBI had spent decades chasing a ghost. Hundreds of suspects had been investigated, countless hours of manpower dedicated, and yet the case remained stubbornly unresolved. Some agents began to question whether it was solvable at all. Still, the legend lived on. Annual CooperCon gatherings in Washington brought together enthusiasts and amateur detectives. Treasure hunters continued to search the forests and rivers of the Northwest, convinced that the answers were still out there. And every so often, a new suspect or confession would grab headlines, only to fade away like all the others. For the public, D.B. Cooper was no longer just a man. He was a mystery that symbolized something larger. The idea that even in an age of constant surveillance and technological progress, one person could disappear without a trace. But inside the FBI, the unsolved case was a source of frustration. They had prided themselves on solving even the most complex crimes, yet this one man had eluded them. As years turned to decades, Cooper's shadow only grew larger. Then, in 2016, came an announcement that shocked many. After 45 years, the FBI officially declared that it was closing the active investigation into D.B. Cooper. While tips would still be accepted, the Bureau admitted that it was no longer dedicating resources to solving the case. For the FBI, it was a recognition of reality. The trail had gone cold long ago, and the chances of new evidence emerging were slim. For the public, however, the announcement only cemented Cooper's status as a legend. The case was now beyond law enforcement. It belonged to history, to speculation, to folklore. Yet even as the official file closed, the questions remained. Who was D.B. Cooper? Did he survive the jump? Was he a skilled professional who planned every detail, or a desperate man who gambled everything and perished in the night? The lack of answers ensured the story would never fade. The silence of the decades had not weakened the mystery, it had strengthened it. The man in the black tie, the polite hijacker who lit a cigarette and ordered a bourbon before vanishing into the storm, had achieved something few could ever claim: immortality through mystery. But even legends leave behind clues. And in the years following the FBI's closure of the case, fresh evidence and modern analysis would breathe new life into the story, suggesting that perhaps, even after all this time, D.B. Cooper might still reveal his secrets. Even after the FBI officially closed the case in 2016, the legend of D.B. Cooper refused to die. If anything, the Bureau's announcement sparked fresh waves of interest. For decades, investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths had been captivated by the mystery. And now, with the case officially retired, it belonged fully to the public imagination. But this wasn't the end of the investigation. Not really. The truth was, people were more determined than ever to solve the puzzle. And with new technology, fresh suspects, and crowdsourced detective work, the mystery of D.B. Cooper entered a new phase. One of the most intriguing discoveries came from a group of citizen researchers who revisited Cooper's tie, the same piece of evidence that had been preserved since that rainy night in 1971. Using advanced microscopic analysis, they found tiny particles embedded in the fabric: titanium, rare earth elements, and metals often associated with aerospace and manufacturing industries. These weren't the kinds of particles that would simply accumulate in everyday life. To many, it suggested Cooper may have worked in or around the aerospace industry, perhaps even Boeing itself. The revelation was tantalizing. If true, it explained how he knew so much about the Boeing 727, the only commercial plane at the time with rear stairs that could be lowered in flight. It also explained his precise instructions to the pilots, which matched knowledge someone with technical aviation experience would possess. But knowing where he may have worked was not the same as knowing who he was. The suspects list remained long and murky. Over the years, names had piled up: Kenneth Christensen, the ex-paratrooper and airline employee; Dwayne Weber, the man with the deathbed confession; William Gossett, a military veteran who had boasted of his connection to the crime; and even more obscure figures. Each brought their own set of coincidences, circumstantial evidence, and personal quirks. But none brought the smoking gun. Then came the possibility of DNA. The partial samples recovered from Cooper's tie offered some hope, though the technology was limited. In recent years, with advances in forensic genealogy, investigators and citizen sleuths alike began to wonder if the same methods used to solve decades-old cold cases could one day be applied to Cooper's DNA. For now, though, that hope remains uncertain. The samples are small, degraded, and may not even belong to Cooper himself, since others may have handled the tie before or after the hijacking. Meanwhile, the riverbanks of the Pacific Northwest continued to whisper their own secrets. The discovery of ransom money on the Columbia River in 1980 had been one of the few tangible clues in the entire case. Forensic analysis of the bills and the soil around them suggested they had likely been deposited years after the hijacking, further complicating the mystery. Had the money been buried deliberately by Cooper, perhaps as a decoy or to hide it until he could return? Or had nature simply carried it downstream, scattering a fraction of his loot while the rest remained hidden? Treasure hunters still scour the area today, some convinced the rest of the ransom lies buried in the soil or caught in the bends of the river. Others argue that Cooper himself may have recovered the majority of the cash and left the small bundle behind, whether by accident or design. What made the mystery endure was not just the lack of answers, but the endless number of possibilities. If Cooper died in the jump, it explained the absence of spending, the lack of sightings, the silence that followed. But if he lived, it opened 1,000 more doors. Did he quietly build a new life somewhere, never touching the money? Did he pass away in obscurity, leaving his secret unspoken? Or was he perhaps someone well-known, hiding in plain sight all along? Each theory carried its own allure, its own narrative weight. And as time passed, the cultural legacy of D.B. Cooper grew stronger than any single answer could. Television shows, films, and books kept his memory alive. True crime podcasts devoted entire seasons to examining the case from every angle. Internet forums filled with amateur detectives who dissected the FBI files, which had been partially released to the public. Some spent years combing through records, maps, and weather reports from that fateful night, building elaborate reconstructions of the jump. One such analysis even suggested that Cooper's chosen jump zone was too dangerous and imprecise for a man of his supposed intelligence. If he truly wanted to survive, why leap into a storm over wild terrain? Could it be that Cooper miscalculated, or was desperate enough to take the risk anyway? Others, however, argued the opposite, that Cooper was brilliant and had chosen his moment with absolute precision. Perhaps he knew the terrain intimately. Perhaps he had a pickup waiting. Perhaps, against all odds, he had slipped away, laughing at the thought of FBI agents combing the woods in vain. Even today, no consensus exists. And maybe that's the true power of the story. The lack of resolution has allowed D.B. Cooper to become more than a man. He is a blank canvas, onto which people project their own ideas of rebellion, cleverness, or tragedy. For the FBI, the case may be closed, but for the public, it remains very much alive. Cooper is celebrated at festivals in the Pacific Northwest. Bars still serve D.B. Cooper cocktails. Enthusiasts trade theories as though they are pieces of a grand puzzle waiting to be solved. The legend thrives not because of what we know, but because of what we don't. The image is iconic. A man in a suit sipping bourbon, his eyes hidden behind sunglasses. Calm, polite, yet carrying a secret plan that no one else could see. A man who, in one bold leap, became timeless. The decades of silence have only added weight to the story. With each passing year, the chances of solving it grow slimmer. Most investigators agree that if Cooper survived, he is almost certainly dead now. If he perished in the jump, his remains may never be found. And yet the question lingers. What if, just what if, Cooper succeeded? What if he lived to see the world move on, carrying his secret to the grave? As long as that possibility exists, the story will never die. D.B. Cooper is not just a name in an FBI file. He is a legend, a riddle, a ghost haunting the skies of the Pacific Northwest. But legends, like all mysteries, eventually come to a crossroads. And for Cooper, that crossroads is found not just in the speculation of what happened, but in the lessons left behind. The way his story changed air travel, the way it reshaped security, and the way it revealed something about the public's fascination with the unknown. The question of who D.B. Cooper was may remain unanswered, but the story of how he changed history is very clear. In the years that followed the hijacking, D.B. Cooper's story became more than a mystery. It became a turning point. While the man himself disappeared into legend, his actions reshaped aviation, law enforcement, and even the way Americans thought about crime and myth. Almost immediately after the hijacking, airlines and the government took action. Commercial air travel in the early 1970s had been surprisingly casual. Passengers could buy tickets with cash, walk straight onto planes without security screenings, and carry almost anything in their luggage. Cooper had exploited this system perfectly. In response, sweeping changes were introduced. By 1973, mandatory screenings were put in place at airports across the United States. Metal detectors and bag checks became standard, and passengers could no longer board with the same ease as before. Though some complained at the time, these measures drastically reduced the number of hijackings, which had become alarmingly frequent in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In many ways, D.B. Cooper forced the modern era of airport security into existence. His one bold crime showed how vulnerable the system had been, and authorities moved quickly to close those loopholes. For investigators, however, the case remained an open wound. The FBI's inability to capture Cooper became one of the Bureau's rare unsolved mysteries. Over the decades, agents poured tens of thousands of hours into the case. They interviewed more than 1,000 suspects. They analyzed everything from weather patterns to military records. And yet, for all their effort, they ended where they began, with questions but no answers. But while the FBI carried the frustration of an unsolved case, the public carried something else: fascination. The legend of D.B. Cooper tapped into something uniquely American. The idea of the lone rebel, defying authority, slipping away under the noses of the most powerful institutions. To some, he was a reckless criminal who risked innocent lives. To others, he was a folk hero, someone who outwitted the system without firing a shot. That tension, criminal or hero, villain or icon, was part of what made the story so enduring. In books and films, Cooper was often romanticized. Writers speculated on his survival, imagining him living quietly in the Pacific Northwest or starting over under a new name. In one version, he dies heroically in the wilderness. In another, he enjoys a long life, secretly proud of the greatest unsolved heist in American history. Pop culture embraced him fully. Songs were written. TV shows referenced him. Novels spun elaborate tales around his disappearance. Even Hollywood couldn't resist. Stories loosely based on Cooper appeared on screen, feeding the fascination of new generations. Meanwhile, amateur sleuths took up the chase. Some searched the forests of Washington with metal detectors and shovels, convinced they would find Cooper's hidden fortune. Others pored over FBI files online, debating weather conditions, flight paths, and possible landing zones. Conferences and conventions dedicated to the case drew crowds of enthusiasts, each eager to share theories. What united them all was not certainty, but the thrill of the unknown. In a world where most mysteries are eventually explained, D.B. Cooper remained elusive. And perhaps that's why his story still resonates. Cooper became a blank slate, a mirror reflecting the desires and fears of the people who studied him. Was he a brilliant mastermind who executed the perfect escape? Or was he a desperate man whose leap into the night was his final mistake? The evidence points in both directions. The storm, the altitude, and the wilderness suggest a near impossible chance of survival. But the absence of a body, the missing ransom, and the careful planning suggest the opposite, that he might have pulled it off. And so, the myth survives precisely because the truth does not. But beyond the myth, Cooper's story also holds lessons. It reveals the vulnerabilities of a system that once took safety for granted. It shows how quickly a single event can reshape entire industries. And it underscores the limits of even the most powerful institutions. For the FBI, Cooper's escape was a reminder that not every case can be solved, no matter how much manpower is thrown at it. For airlines, it was the catalyst that ended an era of casual, unsecured travel. For the public, it became proof that mystery still existed in a modern world increasingly dominated by surveillance and technology. Even today, more than 50 years later, the case still captures attention. Documentaries continue to be made. New suspects are debated. Occasionally, someone steps forward with a new confession, a new theory, or a supposed piece of evidence. Each time, headlines flare with the possibility that the mystery may finally be solved. But each time the answers remain elusive. And maybe that is the way it was always meant to be. Some mysteries are less powerful when solved. The legend of D.B. Cooper thrives not in its answers, but in its questions. On that cold November night in 1971, a man boarded a plane with nothing more than a briefcase, a plan, and a name that wasn't his own. He was polite, calm, almost ordinary. And then he did something extraordinary. He hijacked a plane, took the money, and vanished into the storm. Whether he lived or died, whether he was a mastermind or a man driven by desperation, no one can say for certain. But in that single act, he stepped out of history and into myth. The mystery of D.B. Cooper endures not because of what we know, but because of what we never will. His story is told in the silence between facts, in the space where possibility lives. He remains a question mark in American history, a man who leapt into the darkness and never came back. And as long as people wonder, as long as they gather in small towns or on internet forums, as long as they raise a glass in a bar named after him or hum a song written in his memory, D.B. Cooper will live on. Not as a criminal file, not as a case number, but as a legend. The man in the suit. The passenger in 18C. The hijacker who vanished into thin air. The one mystery that, even after half a century, refuses to let go.